So we're going to cover background, a bit of an overview, and talk about enhancements in this session. So I suppose the first point would be, and I think this is actually just sort of context, but Microsoft's been in the virtualization market for quite some time. For those who've been in the game for quite a while, you might remember in 2003, Microsoft acquired Connectix. So they actually acquired that company, bought them in. They then actually integrated that into a product called Virtual Server, which they released in 2005. Then they rebranded and actually launched Hyper-V with Windows Server in 2008. So Microsoft's been in the server virtualization game for a while. What they didn't do is probably put as much effort in R&D and development effort as some others in the market did, and some others jumped a lead on them. But they've actually been in this market for quite some time. I suppose Server 2012, and why consider Server 2012, and you're here so you're obviously looking at it. I think the interesting point is the amount of progress they've made since Server 2008 R2 with Hyper-V is unbelievable. When you actually see where they've either met or surpassed their competitors in the market in the space of what is under 3 years, shows how much development effort and how serious they are about this market now. Microsoft is an organisation that if you've been around Microsoft for a while, will actually have a competitor get a lead on them, and they'll just out-innovate, out-market, and actually get and peg them back. There was a while there where everybody looked at Novell and said they'll never surpass them, they'll never peg them back, and they have. It's just, they seem to be one of those organisations. And the advances they've made with Server 2012 are quite incredible. So I think you'll actually be pretty impressed. Considerable savings are available, and that's in the order of 6 times. And when I'm talking about considerable savings, if you're paying for a different virtualization solution, and you're looking at Server 2012, you're obviously paying for that virtualization solution. If you look at a Server 2012 based platform, and we can run through that with you separately because everybody's different. But Microsoft reports you can actually save that about 6 times. And that means if you're paying this solution out here, by just adopting Server 2012, you'll accelerate that saving. The other thing that Microsoft has got with Server 2012 is some pilot incentives that are available through partners like Data3. So if you want to look at Server 2012 and run a pilot and actually assess whether it's actually going to work for you, there is funding available under a program to actually pilot Server 2012. I suppose the other point is, with Server 2012, yes, virtualization is one of the main things that's been enhanced, but there is actually an array of other things that have improved with Server 2012 as well. I suppose the key point is, with Server 2012, you get the power of many types of different servers, the simplicity of one. What that means is Server 2012 can be your virtualization platform. It can be the integration and front end point to your storage platform. If you're looking at provisioning some public cloud infrastructure out of something like Azure, Windows Server can be in the cloud. It's a common platform, common interface, and it's a familiar tool that most people know. So you can actually spin up many types of different servers and instances with Server 2012, but it's a familiar look and feel. Microsoft's going to talk a lot more about every app, every cloud, and modern work style enabled. That means that with Server 2012, you can actually spin up an on-prem private cloud type of instance of Server 2012, Azure, and also partner hosted. So you have a familiar set of tools and a familiar interface across those different types of servers. I suppose a couple of the key points is, we talked to clients about Hyper-V in the past with Server 2008 R2, and there were some missing things. And one of them was shared nothing live migration. They've actually got that in the product, and that's some of the advanced functionality that's come out. Hyper-V network virtualization, so the network virtualization is pretty important. And one of the other points is the low-cost, highly available file-based storage. This is probably another representation of what Microsoft was talking about before, but what this is effectively saying is that with Windows Server 2012, you have one consistent platform across on-premise, in the public cloud up in something like Azure or a service provider, which is Data3. And you have all these different types of service solutions which are actually underpinned by Server 2012. Identity and the enhancements in rights management services and Active Directory Federation services. Virtualization with Hyper-V out of the box. You've got the DirectAccess, DevOps and management, and the enhancement and management tools, as well as the development environment itself. So you have all those different types of service solutions out of the box with Server 2012, one product. Some of the actual enhancements and getting into server virtualization and talking to that, scale and performance is one of the things that Microsoft was criticised for with Hyper-V in the past. And you'll see in an upcoming slide, the enhancements between Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012 are quite incredible. So they've got larger virtual machines to support increased workloads, and they've also got hardware offloading for better scale and performance. they've got virtual machine mobility, which is obviously really important when you're actually looking at critical workloads. You can get simultaneous live migration without actual loss of connectivity, including shared nothing storage. So you do have some amazing enhancements in the ability to fail over and have high availability. And that shared nothing live migration allows you to enable live migration between clusters. There's clustering enhancements as well, which increases availability. I suppose the other point is Windows Server, so it is open and extensible. There's a massive ecosystem of partners that integrate to that, and you'll start to see third-party solution shipping, which actually integrate to Server 2012 as well. PowerShell really became a first-class citizen with Server 2008, and that's enhanced with Server 2012 as well with PowerShell. We've got network virtualization, and there's also resource metering, which actually allows you to show what resourcing in a multi-tenant type scenario. So there's actually increasing support for multi-tenancy. Now, multi-tenancy, you think, well, how does that apply to me? If you're in government and you're a shared service provider for multiple agencies, you might provide multi-tenant infrastructure. Well, sorry, if you go through a merger and acquisition, and for a period of time you have to keep your companies isolated, you're in a multi-tenant situation. So multi-tenancy, even in a private cloud scenario, still has its place. And I think this is actually the pretty impressive chart. So we're talking here about some of the features of Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012 in some of these areas. One I'd probably call out is the virtual processors per virtual machine. You can have up to 64 with Server 2012. I think the other one that's actually pretty interesting is the physical memory, 4 terabytes in the hosts. The amount of virtual processors per host, 1,024. And the other one I think we're going to call out was the virtual processors per virtual machine as well. So there's some amazing enhancements out of the box there. I think you'd agree that in a very short space of time, there's some impressive scalability enhancements with Server 2012. So Microsoft's done a lot of work on engineering to actually enhance Hyper-V.
So when Microsoft started on the journey of development of Windows Server 2012, they looked around at some of the industry trends. So some of them were obvious. Cloud computing is a trend that has been in the news, in your face. I think everyone's sick of the word cloud. If you're not, you're going to be very soon, because you're going to hear a lot more about it with Windows Server 2012. Data is another trend. Who needs less storage? Who's paying less for storage? Yeah. So storage costs continue to grow. Even though the cost per gig or the cost per terabyte drops, the amount of storage just increases on a massive scale. And we also have mobility. Now, mobility, quite often people think about mobility in terms of end user devices. So I need to roam with my device, but it's also for the server workloads that you don't see in your data center. So increasingly, people are looking for active-active data center solutions. People are looking to be able to transition workloads between their on-premise private cloud and a public cloud like Azure, or a hosted environment like Data3. Microsoft also looked at trends in technology. So in the compute space, we have increasing processing power. We have the cost of memory going down, disk expanding, etc. And you'll see that ongoing the trend is for applications to consume more compute resource, and it's now expected that your virtualization environment will support much heavier workloads. We're reaching a point where people are virtualizing, if not everything, close to everything in their environment, and that's a general expectation. In terms of networking, there are network cards that are able to take some of the work off the server and increase performance over the network. And Microsoft have also looked at reducing the cost of your networking. So looking at converged networks, looking at things like channeling all your storage over Ethernet and using 10 gig or InfiniBand connectors to do that, giving you the same performance that you'd expect from a fiber channel connection, block level device. And you've also got storage. So Microsoft here are looking at taking advantage of some of the new functionality that's available in modern storage arrays, like storage management interfaces, like ODX, being able to offload large copy operations onto the array, but also looking at how can we provide cost-effective solutions for cases where you just need large amounts of storage, or where you don't need the smarts in the storage, you just need a large amount of it and you need it to be quick. Microsoft have looked at all of those and they've looked at their own experience internally, they've looked at the experience of their customers, where they're looking to go. They've looked at Windows and then gone, okay, so what do we do to achieve that? And they've thought up scenarios, and as they've worked through those scenarios, they've looked at, is there a bottleneck here, is there a feature that's quiet here? With Windows Server 2012 and with a top-shelf, world-class system management solution on top of it. So if we look at some of the features and enhancements, there are certain themes that come through. So the first is support for cloud computing. Now, Scott presented as the cloud OS, as the consistent platform. And that's very much the case, where Microsoft are envisioning Windows Server 2012 as the platform that you use on-premise, the platform that you use in the cloud, whether it's a public cloud like Azure or a hosted environment like Data3. They're looking at continuous availability, because more and more customers are expecting high levels of availability, not just for some of their serious workloads and public-facing workloads, but internal workloads, because they understand the impacts they're going to have on their business. There are a lot of enhancements that seek to maximise performance and scale and make sure that Server 2012, over the next couple of years in between releases, stands up to the competition and provides a competitive platform. And leveraging the capabilities of new hardware, whether it's network cards, storage arrays, etc. The last one is, I think, very important. So with Windows Server 2012, if you're going to use that as an operating system across your private cloud, if you want that to be an underlying platform that's abstracted from your workloads, if you want that to be an environment that scales across your data center, across data centers and into other environments, you need to be able to manage that. You need to be able to manage it effectively. And if you're looking at deploying that into a hosted environment or a public cloud environment, you need to be able to manage that at scale very effectively in an automated fashion. So, continuing with management, Microsoft invested heavily. So PowerShell, PowerShell, PowerShell. You'll see it on the next slide, so I won't go into too much detail. If you looked at it in Windows 2008 and thought, yep, that's great, but I'm not really seeing it, look at it again in Windows Server 2012, because now it's ubiquitous. So everything that you can do through PowerShell. Identity, because whether it's Active Directory and that needs to function in a virtualized environment, or whether you need to authenticate applications across multiple environments, that's an important area to cover. Access, so things like DirectAccess, which was released in 2008 R2, but not widely deployed, making that simpler and easier to deploy. Virtualization and storage, because from a virtualization perspective, storage is a big component and quite often a costly component. So you want to make sure that you leverage your investments, potentially reduce your investments where possible. So we'll start with management. You'll have to excuse me if we don't cover all the features that are new in Windows Server 2012. It's purely because there are so many of them. And we're really trying to call out some of the standout enhancements. The Server Manager is definitely one of those. Unlike the Server Manager in previous versions of Windows, it's designed around multi-server management, and unashamedly so. Whether it's adding a feature or removing a feature or configuring particular services that are supported by it natively, it's designed to do that from the one point, whether it's on a management server, on your desktop, you do it all from that point and you can do it remotely. Now that's a great story because with Windows Server 2012, you also have the ability to go effectively headless. Windows 2008 R2, there was the ability to install Windows effectively without a GUI, just a command line interface, not widely adopted. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. Because PowerShell wasn't ubiquitous, multiple tools that you might need to utilise to manage the server. The remote management tools quite often weren't all that you wanted them to be. Didn't easily support all of the roles. Well, that's changed. So all of the roles are now supported in a server core, and it really comes down to third-party applications that you might install on a server as to whether you can install server core or install an intermediary mode where you're installing some basic graphical elements but not the full-blown desktop environment. PowerShell 3, Windows Management Framework. So Microsoft have seen that one of the biggest impediments for applications being supported across multiple environments is the ability to effectively manage those applications, but also manage the underlying infrastructure. If you follow some of the data center trends, you'll probably see people complaining about a lack of data center standards. So Microsoft are investing heavily into things like WS-MAN, remote management, WMI, and making sure that PowerShell can sit on top of all of those elements and provide a way to easily automate and interact with Windows devices and third-party devices. So through open standards, PowerShell can now interact with hardware devices that support that. So potentially you could, through PowerShell, reach out and interact with a switch port. And last, but certainly not least, we'll talk a lot about Windows Server 2012 and how it's the cloud OS and how it enables a private cloud. And that's what it does. It enables a private cloud. It's not a private cloud in of itself. It needs a number of management elements to give it all those characteristics of a private cloud. And if you have a Microsoft-focused environment or you have existing investments in System Center management products, you'll find that you're able to build out all those elements using System Center. So PowerShell. I said it was ubiquitous, over 2,400 commandlets now. Simplified script authoring environment to make it easier to figure out what the commands are and build your scripts. Support for things like disconnected sessions. So when you're running a PowerShell script and it's executing remotely on one or more servers, being able to support network connectivity dropping temporarily and continuing to function. And in a similar way, being able to support things like scheduling and delegated administration. So you quite often think of PowerShell as being something that's happening interactively as you're typing it, but with PowerShell 3, that's definitely not always the case. And where does this lead us? To automation. So the dream of having a private cloud on-premise is really a dream of being able to abstract your infrastructure and not think about it so much. And the key to doing that is effective management. Your management tools being able to effectively interact with your operating system platform and being able to automate where possible. I'll talk very briefly around identity. I think use of the Microsoft platform for some form of identity management, even if it's just Active Directory domain services, is pretty prevalent throughout most organisations. There have been lots of little incremental changes. I won't go into too many of those, but a couple of standouts are things like Active Directory virtualisation and cloning. So in a virtual environment, it's important that your domain controller can understand that it is running in a virtual environment. Because in a virtual environment, your OSI may get switched off, it may get moved, it may get modified much more easily than would happen to a physical hardware platform. So with Windows Server 2012, Active Directory understands if it's running on a Hyper-V environment, and if something changes that's likely to affect timing and its replication to other partners, it will initiate steps, reach out to other domain controllers and seek to get updates from them rather than sending out its updates to ensure that it doesn't cause issues due to something that might have happened to it. And cloning is now possible by taking a single virtualized domain controller, cloning it, and then standing that up as another domain controller. So it could become very easy to build one, take it, clone it again, when a little bit more scale, clone it again. DNS security extensions, they're available in 2008 R2. Not a lot of people are deploying deploying them at this point. Really it's around when you do a lookup on a DNS record, making sure that you have some measure of knowing that it's a valid response that you're getting from a trusted provider. So that's what it's all about. It's about denial of service attacks or man-in-the-middle attacks, avoiding those kind of things. I don't know if it's likely to become more common over the short term, but Microsoft have certainly invested in making sure that it complies with the latest standard, integrates with Active Directory, and is easier to integrate into your DNS infrastructure. Dynamic access control, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, is a bit of a changer, and it's probably not something that you're going to just chuck out into your environment without some serious consideration. But basically what it does is gives you a claims-based approach to getting access to file data. Now, while in Data 3 we may look at file data and go, well, file servers, we don't really have many of those anymore. Everything's kind of portal-based because we roam a lot and it's available here, there and everywhere. But I know organisations where they have petabytes of data. As you scale with that amount of file data and as you scale with more people, what tends to happen is you get an explosion of groups. And I've seen organisations where they have not just thousands but tens of thousands of delegation groups. And you find that individual users have got so many groups for delegation to file shares, applications, etc., that they're actually stretching the friendship on the size of a Kerberos token, and they can't log on anymore. So this provides the ability to potentially look at reducing the amount of groups that you use for file data, instead take a claims-based approach, and does a whole lot more, which we'll see on this slide. So the first thing that dynamic access control does is allows you to look at your file data and classify it and tag it. And there's a lot of, as we'll see in a demo in a minute, there's a lot of flexibility in how you do that. Generally, you're going to be looking at things like Active Directory for some of those attributes that you're tagging objects with. But integrating with your file server management tools, you may be looking at more abstract things like, okay, is there a file there that contains a credit card number? I'm going to tag that as secured and then either restrict access or trigger encryption of that using rights management services. Now, classification can happen automatically on the file server, initiated by the file server, or it can be tagged by applications, or you can go in and manually tag it. We'll look at a simple operation where you go in and manually tag some folders and restrict access based on that. So your access is then based on classification. So can I access this file? What department are you in? Is this a classified file? Are you in the right organisational unit? Instead of having to rely on groups to do that, you can rely on attributes. Now, one of the important things to mention here is that if you're looking at Active Directory and you're looking at some of the attributes within Active Directory to lay claim to access to data, then you want to make sure that that data in Active Directory is up to date and accurate, and you want to understand who has delegated rights to update that. So if I'm delegating access to a file and people can, by department, and people can go into Active Directory and modify their own department attribute, well, that's not a great solution. If you do look to adopt this, think carefully about what attributes you're using to lay claim to data, and potentially look at what are your sources of truth in your environment for data, and do I need an identity management solution like Forefront Identity Manager to make sure that I do have the right data coming from the right sources of truth into Active Directory. The other important element is not just access control, but auditing who has had access. Again, you can control those centrally and audit user claims, device claims based on expressions. You can also simulate policy changes so that as you're about to make changes, you can understand what they're going to do in the environment. If you really need to extend that out into securing data not only at rest on the system, but potentially as it gets moved, then you may want to look at rights management services. It's available for Office documents. It can be extended. The protection's near real time when a file is tagged. So what it does is if you tag a particular document based on a classification, then RMS can come in and encrypt that document and make it available to specific people within your organisation who have to authenticate via RMS to get access and decrypt that item. Direct access is another thing that in Windows 2008 R2 didn't get a lot of attention from many customers. The first thing was that it relies on IPv6. Not a lot of customers have deployed IPv6. Not a lot of customers have, in their administration teams, have people who understand IPv6 well, and there were quite a number of constraints. So Microsoft have worked hard to make that deployment of direct access a lot simpler. You end up with a unified remote access management interface where you follow through a wizard-driven deployment script, and at the end of that, it deploys your group policy to control how clients are configured, to control how servers are configured. It controls your DNS records, it configures the server, and you can end up with a very simple deployment in a short space of time. Now, a number of changes. So there are less restrictions based on IP addressing. So you can now come in through a single external interface, and you can operate direct access behind network address translation. So you can have a direct access server in your perimeter network behind a firewall device that's doing network address translation already on an IPv4 network, pass that through and achieve a bidirectional VPN connection between your client device and your back-end infrastructure, which means not only can end users roam about, seamlessly have a VPN connection activate when they're off the network so they can access things on the network, but also means that at the same time, your management servers can be managing that client and reaching out the other way. So a number of things that have become simpler. So there's support for Kerberos, certificate-based authentication, smart cards, virtual smart cards, and TPMs. You can have a one-time key. So you have support for dual-factor authentication to kick off. It's really easy for users to see connectivity status. If you swipe in from the side to see your network connectivity, you can see direct access, whether it's connected or not. And there's remediation of common problems and sending customised logs back to your help desk if you're having issues.